Mrs. Wiggs of the Cabbage Patch. Chapter 7. Mr. Bob. If his heart at high flood swamps his brain now and then, 'twas but richer for that when the tide ebbed again. A large audience assembled that night to witness the greatest extravaganza of the century. The opera house was a blaze of light and color. From the recesses of one of the boxes, Redding made a careful survey of the faces beneath him. First nights usually found him there, with the same restless, eager look in his eyes. Tonight he evidently failed to find what he sought, and was turning listlessly away when he stopped suddenly, bent forward, and then smiled broadly. He had caught sight of Billy's red comforter. The boy's hair was plastered close to his head, and his face was transformed by soap and happiness. Redding glanced quizzically at the rest of the party, at the mother's radiant countenance beaming from the dusk of her crape veil, at the three little girls in their composite costumes, and the carnations pinned on each bosom. Then he deliberately turned his back on the greatest extravaganza of the century and centered his attention on the motley group. It was a singularly enthusiastic theater party, oblivious of surroundings and lost in wonder at the strange sight. Billy's laugh rang out frequently with refreshing spontaneity. Their enjoyment was so evident that Redding was surprised at the close of the first act to see them put on their wraps and march solemnly out of the theater. He hastened to the lobby and touched Billy on the shoulder. "Didn't you like the show?" he asked. "You bet," said Billy, his eyes shining and his cheeks flushed. Mrs. Wiggs was hopelessly entangled in a crape veil, but her idea of etiquette was rigid. She disentangled one hand and said with dignity, "I lo this Mr. Bob, Billy's friend. Happy to meet your acquaintance. Asia, speak to the gentleman. Australia, Europeana," with a commanding nod at the each. 3 small hands were thrust at Redding simultaneously, and he accommodated them all in his broad palm. "But why are you going home?" he asked, looking from one to the other. "Where else would we go?" said Mrs. Wiggs in amazement. "Why not stay and see the play out? That was only the first act." "Is there some more, Ma?" asked Asia eagerly. "Why, of course," explained Redding. "Lots more. Now go back and stay until everybody has left the theater, and then you will be certain it's over." So back they went, furnishing an amusing between-acts diversion for the impatient audience. After the curtain descended on the final scene, Redding waited in the lobby while the stream of people passed. The Wiggs had obeyed instructions and were the very last to come out. They seemed dazed by their recent glimpses into fairyland. Something in their thin bodies and pinched faces made Redding form a sudden resolve. "Billy," he said gravely, "can't you and your family take supper with me?" Billy and his mother exchanged doubtful glances. For the past 3 hours everything had been so strange and unbelievable, and that they were bewildered by. "You see, we will go right over to the Bonds and have something to eat before you go home," urged Redding. Mrs. Wiggs was in great doubt, but one of the little girls pulled her skirt and said in pleading tones, "Ma, let's do." And Billy, already casting longing eyes at the big restaurant across the way, she had not the heart to refuse. As they were crossing the street, Asia stopped suddenly and cried, "Ma, there's the Christmas lady getting in the cab. She's seen us, look." But before they could turn, the cab door had slammed. Redding took them in a small apartment curtained off from the rest of the cafe, so only the waiters commented on the strange party. At first there was oppressive silence, and then the host turned to Europeana and asked her what she liked best to eat. A moment of silence ensued, for the small lady, during which she nearly twisted her thumb from its socket, and then she managed to gasp, "Green pups!" Mr. Bob laughed. "Why, you little cannibal," he said, "what on earth does she mean?" "Cream puffs," explained Mrs. Wiggs airily. "She ate 'em once at Mrs. Reed's, the Bourbon Stockyards wife, and she's been talking about them ever since." After this, the ice, while not broken, at least had a crack in it, and by that time the first course was served. Redding was telling them a funny story, and 3 of the audience were able to smile. It had pleased him to order an elaborate supper, and he experienced the keenest enjoyment over the novelties of the situation. The Wiggs ate as he had never seen people eat before. For speed and durability they break the record, was his mental comment. He sat by, and with consummate tact made them forget everything but the good time they were having. As the supper progressed, Mrs. Wiggs became communicative. She still wore her black cotton gloves and gestured with a chicken croquette as she talked. "Yes," she was saying, "Jim was one o' them handy children. When he was 8 years old, he could pedal as good as you could. I guess you heard about our roof. Everybody was talking about it. Billy is taken right after him. Do you know what that boy has gone and done? He's built his pa a monument." "A monument!" exclaimed Redding. "Yes, sir, a tombstone monument. I was allers a-wishin' that Mr. Wiggs could have a monument, and Billy never said a word, but he set his head to it. One day he comes home with a lot of these here tiles what they had thrown out from the tile factory. Some of 'em was just a little nicked, and the others were just as good as new. Well, he kept on getting 'em every day, and 'two till he had a considerable pile. Every night he used to set on the floor, on full with them things, a-fittin' 'em here and a-crackin' 'em off here, but I never paid no attention to him. One night when I come in from Mrs. Acorn's, what did I see on the floor but a sure-enough tombstone slab, and spelt out in little blue tiles down the middle was Pa, gone but not forgotten. I was just that proud I sat down and burst out crying, and made a sort of box to hold it, and chinkled it up with cement, and last Sunday me and the children took it out to fix it up on Mr. Wiggs' grave. Some days we're going to make Jimmy one. You know Jimmy's my boy that's dead." Her eyes filled and her lips trembled. Even the sunshine of her buoyant nature could not dispel one shadow that always lay across her heart. At this moment Billy, doubtless thrilled at the topic being discussed, upset his glass of water, and the deluge descended full upon Australia, drenching the jacket and her blue alpaca. Such a wail as arose! Threats and persuasions were alike unavailing. She even refused to be mopped off, but slid in a disconsolate heap under the table. Redding attempted to invade the citadel with an orange as flag of truce, but his overtures were ineffectual, and he was compelled to retreat under fire. "I'd leave her be, Mr. Bob," advised Mrs. Wiggs placidly, as she spread her salad on a piece of bread. "She'll get to hold her breath if you notice her." "Billy," said Redding, taking Mrs. Wiggs' advice and ignoring the flood sufferer, "how would you like to be my office boy?" "I'd like it heaps," answered Billy promptly. Redding turned to Mrs. Wiggs. "You see, it's a newspaper office, and while the pay isn't much at first, still it's better than peddling kindling, and there would be a chance for promotion as he got older." "Oh, yes," answered Mrs. Wiggs complacently. "There wouldn't be no trouble about Billy potential. I expect he could take to writing newspapers right away if you could hold him down to it. He's just like his pa, the very spittin' image of him. Mr. Wiggs was so educated, the most fluent man in geography I ever seen. I'm going to be like Mr. Bob when I grow up, said Billy stoutly. His recollection of his paternal parent was not the sort ideal are made of. Just then the waiter appeared with the final course, and Asia lifted the tablecloth and whispered, "Say, Straley, we've got ice cream?" No answer. Then little Europina, with baby wisdom, put her towhead under the cloth and said, "Charlie, it's pink." And Australia emerged tear-stained but smiling, and finished her supper on Mr. Bob's knee. When the limit of capacity had been tested to the fullest, and Billy had declared that he couldn't swaller no more, he was just chewin', Redding filled their pockets with candy, and when Mrs. Wiggs was not looking, put a quarter in each hand, and then he rang for a carriage, and in spite of Mrs. Wiggs' protestations, he put them in and repeated Billy's directions as to the exact location of the cabbage patch. My, ain't this nice," said Mrs. Wiggs, leaning back against the carriage cushions for the first time in her life, while Redding lifted Europina in beside her. "We've seed a good time for once in our lives," said Asia. It was the first time she had spoken since they left the theater. "Let me ride up on top, Ma," demanded Billy eagerly. "Let me too, let me," came from the sleepy Australia, who did not know what new attraction was being offered, but was resolved not to miss anything. "All right, Billy. But Austrie, you must stay with Ma. Goodbye, Mr. Bob, and thanks for one and all." Redding stood on the corner where they had left him, and the smile died out of his face. Within a block was a jolly crowd, and a hearty welcome. Across the street was the big apartment house, where his dark and cheerless window promised him nothing. For a moment he stood irresolute. "There is certainly nobody to care where I go," he thought gloomily, and suddenly the smile came back. "But if I'm to be Billy Wiggs' model, I guess I'd better go to bed." He ran lightly across the street and up the broad stone steps. Chapter 8. Mrs. Wiggs at Home. She had a sunny nature that sought, like a flower in a dark place, for the light. On Christmas Day, Lucy Alcott stood by the library window and idly scratched initials on the frosty pane. A table full of beautiful gifts stood near, and a great bunch of long-stemmed roses on the piano filled the room with fragrance. But Lucy evidently found something more congenial in the dreary view outside. She was deep in thought when the door opened and Aunt Chloe came in with a basket and a note. The old woman grinned as she put the basket on the floor. "You might 'a' knowed it was from dem Wiggs," she said. Lucy opened the note and read, "Dear Miss Lucy, the basket of clothes and victuals come. We are so much obliged, and Asia wore the red dress to the social and enjoyed herself so. Much I wish I could 'a' went. Billy liked his hock and ladder. Me and the children want to send you a Christmas mess of some of all we laid in for to live on. They is potatoes, 2 kinds, onions, tomatoes, and a jar of vinegar, and a jar of preserves. I bought the peaches last summer. They were getting a little rotten, and I got them cheap. Hope you will enjoy them. I send some of all we got but coal and flour. Thanks to you for your kind feelings. From yours no more, Mrs. Wiggs." "Bless her old heart," cried Lucy. "That's the biggest widow's mite I ever saw. Put the basket there with my other presents, Aunt Chloe. It's worth them all." She went over to the fire and held her hands to the friendly blaze. There was a restless, discontented look in her eyes, and proved only too plainly that her Christmas was not a happy one. "I wish it was night," she said. "I hate Christmas afternoon. Mother's asleep, and it's too early for callers. I believe I'll go down to the cabbage patch." Aunt Chloe stuck out her lip and rolled her eyes in deprecation. "Don't you do it, honey. What you want to be fooling round with those poor trash for? Why don't you set her by de fire and bleach your hands for de party tonight?" "Bother the old party," said Lucy impatiently. 15 minutes later she was tramping through the snow, her cheeks glowing with her spirits rising. The Wiggs, while always interesting, had of late acquired a new significance. Since seeing them in the theater lobby with Robert Redding, she had found it necessary to make several visits to the Cabbage Patch. The chief topic of conversation had been Mr. Bob, how he had taken them to the show, had made Billy his office boy, had sent them a barrel of apples, and was coming to see them some day. To which deluge of information Lucy had listened with outward calmness and inward thrills. Today, as she entered the Wiggs' gate, a shout greeted her. Billy let himself down from the chicken-coop roof and ran forward. "Them Roman candles wasn't no good," he cried. "One of 'em busted too soon, and most blew my hand off." "Oh, no, it didn't, Miss Lucy," said Mrs. Wiggs, who had hastened out to meet her. "Them Roman candles was fine. Billy's hand wasn't so bad hurt. He couldn't shoot his gumbo shooter and break Miss Cashmer's window pane. I'll be glad when tomorrow comes and he goes back to the office. Come right in," she continued. "Asia, dust off a chair for Miss Lucy. That's right. Now let me help you off with your things." "Let me hold the muff," cried Australia. "No, me!" shrieked Europina. A center rush ensued, during which the muff was threatened with immediate annihilation. The umpire interfered. "Australia Wiggs, you go set in the corner with your face to the wall. European, come here." She lifted the wailing little girl to her lap and looked her sternly in the eyes. "If you don't hush this minute, I'll spank your doll." The awful threat was sufficient. Mrs. Wiggs had long ago discovered the most effectual way of punishing Europina. Then peace was restored. Lucy looked about her. In each window was a piece of holly tied with a bit of red calico, and on the partly cleared table she saw the remains of a real Christmas dinner. "We had a grand dinner today," said Mrs. Wiggs, following her glance. "Mr. Bob sent the turkey. We ate all we wanted and got 'nough left for the rest of the week, countin' hash and soup and all. Asia says she's going to hide it, so as I can't give no more away. By the way, do you notice what Asia's doin'?" Lucy went to the window where Asia was busily working. This taciturn little girl, with her old solemn face and clever fingers, was her favorite of children. "What are you making?" she asked, as the child dipped a brush in one of the 3 cans which stood before her. "She's paintin' a picture," announced Mrs. Wiggs proudly. "Looked like she was just crazy about picture paintin', and I said, 'Well, Asia, if you have made up your mind to be an artist, guess you'll have to be one. Seems like when folks can do piano playin' and picture paintin', it ain't right to let 'em wash dishes and clean up all the time. So I went to a store and asked for some paint to make pictures with, and they wanted 70 cents for a little boxful. Ain't that a mighty heap, Miss Lucy, just for plain paint? For it's made up into flowers and trees and things. Well, anyway, I couldn't get it, but I come home and got me 3 tin cans and got 'em round to Mr. Becker's paint shop, and he poured me a little red and yeller and a blue, and only charged me a nickel, and throwed in a brush. Asia's painted a heap with it. I'll show you some of her things." It was not necessary, for in every direction Lucy looked, her eyes were greeted with specimens of Asia's handiwork. Across the footboard of the bed was a spray of what might have passed for a cauliflower. The tin boiler was encircled by a wreath of impressionistic roses, and on the window pane a piece of exceedingly goldenrod bent in an oblong curve in order to cover the crack in the glass. "It's perfectly wonderful," said Lucy, with entire truthfulness. "Ain't it?" said Mrs. Wiggs, with the odd tone one uses in the presence of genius. "Sometimes I just can't believe my eyes when I see what my children can do. They inherit their education from Mr. Wiggs. He was so smart, and belonged to such a fine family." Lucy made a heroic effort to keep a solemn face as she asked if Asia looked like him. "Oh, my, no," continued Mrs. Wiggs. "He was a brunette, real dark complexion. I remember when he first come a-courtin', me folks thought he was Italian. Pa wasn't, to say, well off in them days." Mrs. Wiggs never applied superlatives to misfortune. "He had a good many of us to take care of, and after Mr. Wiggs had been keeping company with me for about 2 weeks, he drove up one night with a load of coal and kindlin' and called Pa out to the fence. 'Mr. Smoot, see as he has long as I am courtin' your daughter, I think I oughter furnish the fire to do it with. Ef you don't mind,' says he, 'I'll just put the wagon load of fuel in the coal house. I expect by the time it's used up, Nancy'll be of my own thinking.' And I was," added Mrs. Wiggs, laughing. Ordinarily, Lucy found endless diversion in listening to the family reminiscences, but today another subject was on her mind. "How is Billy getting along?" she asked. "Just fine," answered Mrs. Wiggs, "only he comes home at night most dead. I give him money to ride, but every day last week he ate up his nickel." "Oh, who has charge of him now?" Lucy blushed at her subterfuge. "Mr. Bob," said Mrs. Wiggs. "He's the gentleman that took us to supper. He's got money. Asia said he gives the waiter a quarter. Billy is just crazy about Mr. Bob. Says he's going to be just like him when he grows up. He will, too, if he sets his head to it. Only he never can have him big brown eyes and white teeth Mr. Bob's got. Why, when Mr. Bob smiles, it just sorter breaks up his whole face." Lucy's eyes were fixed on the mammoth butterfly, upon whose iridescent wings Asia was putting the finishing touches, but her thoughts were far away. "I just wish you could see him," went on Mrs. Wiggs enthusiastically. "I wish I could," said Lucy with such fervor that Mrs. Wiggs paused on her way to answer a knock at the outside door. There was a scraping of feet in the passage. "I have been driving all over the country looking for you," said a man's voice. "I have some Christmas presents for the kids." Lucy rose hastily and turned just as Redding entered. "Mr. Bob, this is Miss Lucy," answered Mrs. Wiggs triumphantly. "She was just lawin' she'd like to see you." If a blue-eyed angel straight from the peaks of paradise had been presented to him, Redding could not have been more astonished, nor more enraptured. But to Lucy it was a moment of intense chagrin and embarrassment. During the long silence of the past year, she had persuaded herself that Redding no longer cared for her. To be thrust upon him in this way was intolerable. All the blood in her veins rushed to her face. "Do you know where my muff is, Mrs. Wiggs?" she asked, after a formal greeting. "Oh, you ain't goin'?" asked the hostess anxiously. "I wanted you all to get acquainted." "Yes, I must go," said Lucy hurriedly, "if you will find my muff." She stood nervously pulling on her gloves, while Mrs. Wiggs searched for the lost property. There was a deafening tumult in her heart, and though she bit her lips to keep from laughing, the tears stood in her eyes. "Ostrey's under the bed," announced Euripina, who had joined in the quest. "I ain't," came in a shrill, indignant tone, as Mrs. Wiggs dragged forth the culprit and returned the muff. "May I drive you over to the avenue? I'm going that way." It was Redding's voice, but it sounded odd and unnatural. "Oh, no, thank you," gasped Lucy, hardly knowing what she was saying. Her one idea was to get away before she broke down completely. Redding held the door open as she passed out. His face was cold, calm, inscrutable. Not a quiver of the mouth, not a flutter of the lids, but the light went out of his eyes, and hope died in his heart. Mrs. Wiggs stood watching the scene in perplexity. "I don't know what ailed Miss Lucy," she said, apologetically. "Hope it wasn't the toothache."